Before we start today, I just want to let you know this episode does talk about some adult content. So if you have kids around, then you might want to give this a listen on your own first. Hello, and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're going to be looking at the Netflix movie, Dolemite Is My Name. Directed by Craig Brewer and released in 2019, Dolemite Is My Name is a biographical film about the comedian, singer, actor, and film producer Rudy Ray Moore. In the movie, we see Rudy, who's played by Eddie Murphy, as he performs his controversial style of comedy filled with so much profanity that most mainstream radio stations and record labels wouldn't even touch it. His comedy was delivered in a poetic rhythm that would go on to inspire many musicians and earn him the nickname, the godfather of rap. But how well did the Netflix movie show the true story? To help us separate fact from fiction, we'll be chatting with Mark Jason Murray. He was the research consultant for the movie and is the author of Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself, the authorized biography of Rudy Ray Moore, aka Dolemite. Before we chat with Mark, it's time to set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. If you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm about to say 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means 1 of them is an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1. Rudy sold his records out of the back of his trunk. Number 2. Rudy didn't record his comedy album with a live band like we see in the movie. Number 3. Rudy started performing at the age of 42. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to find the 2 facts scattered somewhere throughout the episode. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Mark Jason Murray about the historical accuracy of Dolemite Is My Name. Since filmmakers always need to change things around in order to fit years of someone's life into just a couple hours, if you were to take a step back and give the movie an overall letter grade for historical accuracy, what would it get?
That's really something that's kind of hard to do because it's not a documentary. You know, people have to remember that. Even on my own account, I'll admit that having worked on Rudy's story for 30 years, I was very detail-oriented in all of my research, and it was very hard for me to let go of those details. When they had finished their script, Scott and Larry, who wrote the film, went down and sat in their office, and they let me read the script. And I remember specifically, we sat down on their couch and, what did you think? And one of the first things that I said was, you got Rudy referencing Deep Throat here, but Deep Throat was in 1972, yet Eat Out More Often, the album that he recorded, was in 1970. And, I was even guilty of the, of being so ingrained in the details that they basically sat me down and said, Mark, we have a lot of stuff to go through in this movie. We're trying to give it a point of reference, et cetera, et cetera. And, that was a good, I got, talked down off the ledge a little bit there by Scott and Larry. But as far as a letter grade is concerned, honestly, I don't really know how to answer that. I think it makes that too definitive of a grade, we'll say. You do have quite a bit of material and people to introduce in that 2-hour film. And the average film runs an hour and a half, yet we get, 2 hours worth of Rudy's story. The film itself, if I were to put it in a time frame, would be late 1969 through the mid 1975, after the film Dolemite had its full theatrical national release. Originally, when I saw Ed Wood that Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski wrote for Tim Burton. I believe that was 1996. I was a big fan of Ed Wood, still am. Had a lot of knowledge of him and his work at that time. So when I saw that film, it was like I understood what they were doing. There were certain things in that movie where you have Bill Murray's character of John Breckenridge, who is in the entire film as part of Ed Wood's crew, but yet in reality, he only showed up for the filming of Plan 9 from Outer Space because I think he was a roommate of somebody and they just needed somebody to play that part. So I started to kind of understand the way that they functioned when they were writing. Another perfect example is when they did People versus Larry Flint, which is another spectacular film. In their commentary for the movie, I believe it's Larry that mentions that Edward Norton is really just a combination of multiple lawyers that Larry Flint had. You're not going to spend half of a movie introducing a brand new lawyer every time Larry goes to court. So there has to be some of these things that I'll say are stretched for entertainment purposes. Some of the things that are inaccurate in Dolemite Is My Name, I really think that Scott and Larry brilliantly brought those things together. If I could point out maybe one specific thing that I love in the movie is when the crew meets D'Urville Martin. In the film, they come across him in a strip club. And the reality is that Jerry Jones already knew D'Urville Martin and had brought D'Urville in as director because D'Urville had yet to direct a film. So D'Urville saw this as an opportunity to direct something. But Rudy was smart enough to know that D'Urville already had some type of marquee name, having appeared in movies with Fred Williamson and Pam Grier. So Rudy said, you can direct, but I also want you to co-star in this with me. But that's not as exciting as coming across D'Urville in a strip club, and having Wesley Snipes do, that incredible impersonation, or however you want to put it, of, the personality that he brings to D'Urville's character. Wesley was kind of the unknown gem of the film when you see it. I was actually a little bit, again, I'm so detail oriented. And the first time I saw it, it was like, just, whoa, this is not the D'Urville Martin that I would have expected. I never was able to speak with him. He died early on, so he wasn't, of course, available for my book. But that performance that he gives is just brilliant. And I think a lot of the reviews that people almost say that he kind of almost stole the movie.
You mentioned the dates there, and I wanted to ask you about that because at the beginning of the movie, we see Rudy working at a record shop called Dolphins, and he kind of seems to be disappointed with how his life is going. The impression that I got was he's pretty much just paying the bills and he's not really achieving what he wants. So we don't really get a lot of backstory to Rudy up until the timeline of the movie, which I believe is what you just said, like starting in maybe 1969. Can you give us an overview of his life up until the timeline of the film?
Well, Rudy's entire life was performing, I guess you could say, since the time he was 15. I mean, he had even sang and read poetry in church when he was a child. But he went to Cleveland when he was 15 and entered a talent show. And that was kind of like where the bug started. And for the rest of his life, he was an entertainer. He had done anything for, some of his early things were little scams, I guess you could say. Like he would do fortune telling. They would do tea leaf tellings where they would put the tea leaves in the tea and then they pour out the water, and however the formation of the leaf stuck on the cup would be how they would determine what your fortune was. One of he usually, he admitted, and we discussed this in the book, that he usually knew the people that he was telling the fortunes on, although they weren't aware. But so he, had insider information that he was giving them that worked in his favor. He was some sort of a dancer. Rudy always liked to embellish his greatness. Sometimes he was his greatest PR agent. He would do what he called adagio dancing, and they mentioned that in Dolemite Is My Name, where he would just do these kind of wild African dances. I don't believe that they really had anything that we could remotely consider rhythm. They were more just like these wild shoulder shaking, head shaking dances that he would do sometimes with a female. Rudy was known for standing on his head and doing a split in a chair or something like that. He was always doing something that was, I guess you could say, outrageous. He tried his hand at singing in the 50s and 60s. They mentioned that, of course, in the film. He had already recorded a couple comedy albums by the time Dolemite Is My Name starts. But at the time that the movie does take place, when it does start, his career was dead. It was completely stagnant. He had not had any kind of releases in a few years. I think by that point, he hadn't had a vocal 45 in about 5 years. He hadn't had a comedy release, I think, since 66, and that was a dud. So he really was down and out. He did have his hosting. He was pretty much a host at the Californian Club, but he wasn't really doing anything. So as far as his mindset at that time, he was feeling forgotten. He was feeling like his career was over. And, it's true. Like, is this where I'm at? Am I just a manager of a record store now?
The movie does kind of hint at some of that. I think it was a conversation with his aunt that she mentions, the singer, the fortune teller, all these different things that he's tried. So I got the impression that his life up until that point was very colorful. He did a lot of different things, and was he bouncing around between those different things because he wasn't really happy with just one of them, or did he really just enjoy all of them and just wanted to simply perform for others? Almost didn't really matter how he was performing. He just loved to perform.
I guess if you break Rudy down, his ultimate goal was to be a star. He thought he was a star, and he wanted to be a star. However that might have come about, whichever avenue that took off was the one that he pursued. He would have preferred to have been a singer. Being a singer was his, I guess you could say, his great performance love. Rudy wasn't, I guess you could say, that great of a singer. He wasn't up there with, Little Richard and James Brown. But I do truly believe that Rudy's vocal material does have some value. And he was at the right place at the right time. And he would mention to me that, in kind of in sadness, that he felt like he was there when he needed to be, and he believed that he had the formula that he needed to break through. And I will say that Rudy isn't necessarily original. He's not very original, so to speak. And I'll use that. And not detrimentally, but when he saw a trend happening, then he would follow that trend. We can use. I think some of the examples I use in the book is Little Richard has a song, and then Rudy does one like Robbie Dobby. And so he just kind of plays off of what's popular at that time, and when you put him in chronology of when his vocal recordings started. His first one came in I believe it was January of 1956. He was on Federal Records, which also had signed James Brown. And I believe, if memory is correct, and I don't want to be the guy that just says, I think I say it in the book, but but of course, all of this and more is in the book. But chronologically by catalog number, I believe James Brown's first single was the one just prior to Rudy's first single. So he was right there, at kind of the birth of this to a degree. And he just couldn't make it hit. But he was always constantly trying to make something happen. He sort of fell into doing the comedy when he was in the military, and he worked. He was in a special forces unit that were just going around and entertaining servicemen through Germany and such. And one time there was an act that was late coming on stage, and someone from the crowd yelled, "Tell a joke." And Rudy was familiar with a woman named Caldonia Young, who had done comedy, and I guess she was a contortionist and other things, and famous in that Cleveland area. So Rudy told a joke that he had known from her material, and he said it went over really well, and so that kind of planted the bug for him to start doing comedy. He sort of would put that in his act a little bit here and there. Break up wasn't just singing a song after a song, and I mean, back in those days they had what I guess you would call floor shows. You wouldn't have what we have today, where an artist comes out and plays their hour set, and that's the end of their gig. Many of these were in clubs where they would have 3 or 4 shows a night. You might have a 8 o'clock and a 9 o'clock and a 10 o'clock, and sometimes these would go until 1 or 2 a.m. Usually the set would be about 15 minutes. So sometimes Rudy, as a host, like at the Californian Club, would come out and do a little bit of his stuff, and then he'd introduce the next act, and then maybe an hour later he'd come back on. So he would use the comedy within that. It wasn't until 1961 that he did his first comedy album, which was released on Duto Records, which at the time had all of Red Fox's material. And it was very mild. I guess we could say it was risque for the time. It had double entendre type of material, where you would call a cat a pussy or things like that, but nothing too explicit. And he did a couple more, couple that he actually released on his own. One was called the Beatnik Scene that he did in '62, which I kind of note that it was probably outdated before the record even hit the shelves. Beatnik material. I mean, it was, most people, if they ever think of Beatniks, I guess they think of Maynard G. Krebs from the Dobie Gillis TV show, that was on in the '60s. But I mean, what actually had happened was that he, as the movie shows, Rico the wino did come into the store, and as Rudy would make the comment, he put the touch on me, meaning that he was begging for money, and Rudy would give him a quarter or two, and Rico would tell these tales, and that did inspire Rudy to do that, and what actually happened, and they show this in the film, is he did go and record some of them. But Rudy was also, he wanted to take things to a different level. But he was nervous. There were artists and record companies who had been in some legal trouble for risque material, and Lenny Bruce had been arrested for things that he said on stage. George Carlin had and within a couple years of Rudy's Eat Out More Often had been arrested. So there was some fear of, potential legal issues. But Jimmy Lynch had an album that was selling really well at Dolphins. And the punchline on the record, I mean, the whole record is risque, but until the very end, there's a joke about a a guy who's essentially he's having sex with the gorilla, and the gorilla has a muzzle on, and the big punchline, the buildup is something to the effect of that he's enjoying it, so he says, take the muzzle off the motherfucker, I want to kiss it. And that was selling really well at Dolphins, so that piqued Rudy's curiosity, and so he went and met Jimmy Lynch. I believe it was in Detroit, and when he got there, and he asked Jimmy, have you had any issues with this? And Jimmy said, no. And Rudy's, well, I'm a comedian, I'm a singer, and I'm looking for some new material, and I think this is a direction that I want to go. And Jimmy just said, well, go on with it. And so, but Rudy didn't want to just throw in one F word, and he wanted to take it all the way as far as he could. And they show that in the film where he can't really get anybody to support his album. And when he recorded that, it was recorded in his apartment, similar to what the movie shows. They give a good nod in that scene when they kind of unveil Rudy after the little introduction, and he has a turban on, because when he would sing in the 50s, he would wear a turban, and he called himself Prince Dumar. So that gives a good reference to that, old period before, when he was trying to be a singer. And there's a lot of little details in Dolemite Is My Name that I'm very impressed by. For example, when they go to record that album, you kind of see them walking up some stairs, going to the apartment. And at that time, whether it was intentional or not, but Rudy did live on a second floor apartment. He had a big apartment upstairs above a restaurant, I believe it was. And he was renting rooms to Ben Taylor and T. Tony, and some other comedians would come and go that he had produced albums for. But I guess it had this kind of like big open living room space, and that's where he would set up and recorded that. There was not a live band performing, in the background for that. He went and recorded that music after the fact to mix it in. But one thing that is very impressive to me about that album and what he got and what he built out of that and continued to have success for a few years was, it was very planned out, and to take a peek behind the curtain, it has the appeal that it was recorded in a live club. It has it feels like there's spontaneity to it, but in all actuality, it was a pre-planned thing. Rudy did have a party for his friends. He, vodka and orange juice and we're having a party. So in one way, it truly is a party record. Like, they actually had a party when they recorded it, but they knew what they wanted. And at certain points, they would kind of point to, everybody needs a laugh, and not that they were holding up a sign that says applause or anything, but it was something similar to that, where they were making it do what it needed to do. And although the film shows him performing it live, he never actually had performed that material live. But that does give a really great, it is a really great moment where you can see people kind of go, wait a minute, what is this? And I think that's what people were doing when they heard those albums. And it was kind of funny because I was down on set for the film, when they were shooting those early scenes at the very beginning of the movie, when he's in Dolphins and there was lunchtime or something. And I was sitting there with Larry, one of the screenwriters. And I had mentioned that I was kind of planning on making a YouTube video, because I have all the individual track breakdowns of a lot of those albums. So I have, just the crowd response and, before it's all mixed together. So I can hear I can hear everybody's little bits as they need it. And I had made a comment that I wanted to kind of take that and make a video where you have, Rudy starting to do his material, and then the music kind of fades into it. And then you have the crowd fade into it. So you can see like all those pieces melting together to make the final product. And Larry just looked at me and said, well, we did that in the movie, and that's kind of that scene where he goes up on stage and starts to do the signifying monkey. And then Ben Taylor shows up and starts to add a little piano to it. And, and it was the same thing. So it was like we were on the same wavelength, in a certain way to kind of show how that all came together.
Which, of course, in a movie, that's a great way to do that, to visually see that, as opposed to it. I mean, it'd be more difficult to do that in a movie where you're like on an actual album where the person that's listening to it is not there while it's being recorded. So when in a live setting, you kind of see all that at the same time, and people's reaction to it, like you were saying, in that way. It sounds like not necessarily how it happened, but a great way to show that.
I think if anybody was going to be overly critical about Dolemite Is My Name, it would have been me. It actually took me several viewings to just let it go a little bit. I mean, again, I lived with this for almost 30 years. And so, not that I did not enjoy it when I first saw it. And to be honest with you, I actually cried. I had a private screening at Netflix before the movie came out, which was a really cool experience. And I just kind of sat there, and there was a couple scenes where I just started crying, because it was, on my own side, this was a personal journey that I always wanted to see fulfilled, and not that it happened because of me. This was kind of like the culmination of all of the things that I've been trying to get going, and all the promotion that I've done for Rudy over the years, even after his passing. And I just imagined how he would have felt seeing this, and it was hard not to get choked up about all of this happening.
You mentioned a few things in there I wanted to touch on, and one being like the Rico and the telling the stories, and Rudy recording it, and then going back and turning him in the movie. It looks like he's taking these stories and kind of old jokes, including signifying monkey and Dolemite, and things that seem to, the impression I got from the movie at least, were there beforehand, but then he kind of takes it and makes it his own. And then we do see that the first time that he brings the Dolemite character out, he's wearing a tux and a wig, and he just immediately catches the attention. What did he perform it live at all? Was like the first time that people saw this, what was the reaction?
Well, it wasn't until people heard the records that they started calling him to come out and perform those pieces. So at that point, when it became such a huge success, that became the core of his material. And that album, Eat Out More Often, that they show, and it's fairly accurate too, where they're stamping it with a hand stamp in his living room and assembling the records. Was essentially what Rudy did. He only had a few $100s to press up. I estimate probably 3,000 copies that he pressed up. They were actually blank sleeves, and he had a rubber stamp for everything. One was that little devil logo, which, as they say, why the devil logo? Well, I want these things to look illegal, like you're not supposed to have it. Which to Rudy's credit, like that was a huge selling point. And all of these were just hand stamped on the cover, and he did sell them while he was in Dolphins. They were under the counter, and any other place locally that had them, they were under the counter. And Rudy was concerned, again, that he could get busted for this. But some of the chronology in the film is a little bit different, that he had already released his own version when he took it to Laugh Records. And what happened was Laugh wanted to give him, I don't know, $1,700 or $2,000 or something small like that. and they wanted to put Johnny Otis's name on there because they were working with Johnny Otis, who's a famous singer, band leader. He did the song "The Hand Jive," and Johnny Otis is a really fascinating figure if you want to go back and look at someone from that time period. But he was kind of having these, I guess you could say, showcases that were being recorded and released on Laugh Records. Johnny Otis Presents, Skillet and Leroy, and things of that nature. So they wanted to throw Johnny Otis's name on Rudy's album as well. And Rudy just like, why would I sell you my record for $2,000 or $1,700 or whatever it was, when I already have orders for like 1,000 records from another, distributor down the street? And Rudy was really in tune with the music industry, at least in Los Angeles at that time, much different than the way things were, even in the 80s and of course now. But because he worked at Dolphins, he knew all the record distributors in the area. He knew where to go. John Dolphin had his own record labels. So Rudy knew everything that John would do, where he would get records pressed, where he could get the labels made, where you take them to, the distributors that he would pick up records from and drop off records from. So he already had all those details. So he was very well informed, and it wasn't super difficult for him to get that record around locally. But he realized that, if you're offering me $1,700 or whatever it was, that it's got to be worth a lot more than that. And Rudy claimed that he felt like he had a hit within 20 minutes because he did play it in the store in Dolphins. And he said that within 20 minutes, he had 10 people coming in saying, "What was that record you were playing? I want a copy of that." And he was smart enough to realize, like, I'm onto something. And kind of going back to your comment, a lot of these were pre-existing stories. And they can go back, if you take The Signifying Monkey, there's a book written, it goes back something like 500 years, the origin of that story. And most of these were tall tales and brags that were primarily told, on street corners and barbershops and jail. Guys would be out, playing dice and bullshit. And it was just, in some ways you could say it was a rite of passage. It was just a way for guys to kill time. And when it was encouraged to embellish on these stories. So kind of the best storyteller would be like the cool guy of the group. So if you weren't the best at telling it, you wouldn't be the one who they'd be like nudging, saying, "Dude, hey, tell Pull Shooting Monkey." So there were a lot of these, and some of them had been documented I believe in the 60s by a couple professors, and there are a few books about them. And there had already been a couple instances where these tales had been recorded, and actually this takes us back to Johnny Otis. He had a group called what were they called? Snatch and the Poontangs, which was a kind of a you could say a proto funk band that did a version of Shine in the Great Titanic and some other tales on there, more as musical numbers. And so this wasn't completely unknown material, especially within the Black community. Culturally, there were a lot of people that of course had maybe heard their uncles or their fathers or people in the neighborhood telling a lot of these stories. So one of the things that I attribute to part of the success of those is there's sort of a familiarity to them. These are tales that people grew up with, that people may have even recited to others. And if we go back and we look at it, Rudy was the first one. He wasn't the first one to commercialize it, but he was the first one to be successful, I believe, at commercializing it. Like I said, that Snatch and the Poontangs album had a couple of those tracks on there, which came out in '69, I believe it was, which predates Rudy's album Eat Out More Often by a year, or technically it probably just a couple months. But, we have to remember that records came out so quickly back then. And when Rudy knew he had that success, just like it shows in the movie, he hooks up with Kent Records. But Kent Records wasn't unknown to him. Rudy had already had his 1962 Beatnik Scene album was on Kent Records. He had a couple vocal 45s, not a lot of material from Kent, but they already knew him. And when they saw that he was he was selling all these records locally, that's when they brokered a deal with him and pretty much just said, do whatever you want, we'll release it. And they gave him, interestingly, they gave him like the California distribution. So he had his own label, his Comedian International label, and then Kent would distribute it nationally. And so if you get real deep into collecting Rudy's material, you'll find the majority of those comedy albums. There's a version that's on Comedian International and then one on Kent. Although they're identical in material and almost in their artwork. Usually it's just a transposition of a logo between which one. And generally speaking, if you have those that are on Comedian International, you're going to have a rarer version because those weren't pressed in nationally distributed numbers.
There is a person in the movie we haven't talked about yet, and it's a woman named Lady Reed. She goes by the stage name Queen Bee, and she opens for Dolemite in a lot of the shows, but we don't get a lot of information about kind of who she was, similar to, I guess, the way they did it for Rudy. They don't show a lot of backstory for some of these characters. Can you fill in her story and how she got associated with Rudy?
Unfortunately, there's not really a lot known about her name's Nancy Reed. And she had passed before I really got into working on this book. I mean, my introduction to Rudy was when I was 17 years old in 1991. A couple years after that, I was able to make contact with him. And then in 2001, I basically said, Rudy, I'm writing a book about you. And that's when it, officially started from there. But, she had already passed. Rudy often, if he was, if he felt hurt by something, if there was a lot of emotion involved in things, it would be very hard for him to open up. And I remember he had told me once that after, we'll just call her Lady Reed, after Lady Reed had passed, I believe he wasn't even notified by the family or invited to her funeral. And so that hurt him so much because they were incredible friends. And so it was always very hard for me to get, full details about her. And even those who were in that group often didn't really have a lot of background about her. So it's kind of the majority of what you see in the movie where she talks about, being a background singer in New Orleans and, having a young son. That's relatively like the majority of what was known or what I was able to find out about her. I believe she had come to California for some type of inheritance. And the way that they actually had met was she was kind of hanging out with other friends and would show up at Rudy's gigs. And she was kind of interested in what he was doing. And then they became friends. And so he produced a couple albums for her. She wrote a piece called My Day Has Arrived that he recorded. But they were really close friends. And, it's a shame that I wasn't able to uncover more about her. She gets her due. She's in the movie. And, she was an integral part of that crew that Rudy had.
The next major plot point, we do see her with Rudy and Jimmy and Ben, and they're going to see a comedy called The Front Page. And throughout the whole thing is kind of funny. Everybody's laughing, and these four friends are just like, they don't find it funny. It's not funny at all. But Rudy is very intrigued because he gets the idea that, movies will let him be everywhere all at once, and there's no need for touring. But he can't convince the studio to make movies. So just like he did with the comedy album, he decides he's going to put up the money himself. He figures $70,000 is what he can get and and then what's made, plus the record company kind of sends some money as well. How well did the movie do portraying Rudy basically taking the reins to make his own movie?
Again, they I'm going to just keep gushing about the film. I mean, I just love the movie, and any way that they modified things, I think was brilliant. The idea that they went to this theater and saw this the whitest of white movie they probably could have went and saw. And I love those reactions when they come out. This is bullshit. It wasn't titties or kung fu, or like, this movie sucked.
So this is supposed to be a comedy. They didn't laugh the entire time.
This was not funny at all. And that's not the reality of what happened. It wasn't like they went and saw a movie and Rudy just had this grand idea. But the way that they present that, it is brilliant. You see that light coming down and you think the way those guys write things, and I'm always in awe of the work that they do. So, I couldn't be more happy that they were the ones that wrote this. Nobody could have done it the way that Scott and Larry did. But the reality is that Rudy had already had plans to make films by 72. And also by 72, he already had a couple dozen records out. He was putting records out like every 3 months. There was an avalanche of Rudy Ray Moore records. Rudy was smart enough to go my shit's hot right now, so I'm just gonna, we're just gonna keep unloading on people. And so in 72, he had an idea, I want to get myself on the screen, not really with any true idea of what that would be, just thinking I should be in a movie. I believe he may have gone to American International Pictures at one point early on and discussed it. They were pretty much I guess you could say the primary blaxploitation studio. They were doing all the Jack Hill movies and Pam Grier and Fred Williamson, and so all the best stuff was coming out through AIP. But as with everything else that he'd ever done, nobody really supported him. And so he knew, again, that he had to, he told me flat out, no one was going to put me on the screen, so I had to do it myself. And so he got the ball rolling, and actually that would have started at the tail end of 1973, where he got the idea for to make a film. Didn't know what it was going to be. And there's some key players in here that are missing from the film, and justifiably so, because they just, even though parts of they are integral to the progression of things, you're not going to introduce a character for 3 lines of dialogue and then never see them again. But Rudy had a friend named Jeannie Marie, and there is a reference, we could say, to Jeannie Marie in the film, where when Rudy introduces Lady Reed and they sing that song, if I was a little bitty girl and had a whole lot of money. That song was actually sang by Rudy and Jeannie Marie on the Eat Out More Often album. But again, that's a great way to introduce Lady Reed to the crowd and show that she's going to do some raunchy stuff herself. And they kind of, in a way, she was one of the boys. But Jeannie Marie and Rudy were friends for a long time, and she kind of worked as a secretary for him for many years. And she was really integral because she had met Jerry Jones. And so she introduced Rudy to Jerry Jones, saying, my friend Rudy wants to make a movie. You're a screenwriter, or, you've written plays and such, and brings Jerry Jones into the fold. Now, the way they meet Jerry in the movie, again, is not accurate. But I love that scene too. And I will say that, Jerry Jones was a close friend of mine, and many of the people portrayed in the film, Jimmy Lynch, Ben Taylor, are still close friends of mine. Unfortunately, we lost Jimmy last year. But when it comes to portrayals of the people, I see the most of Jerry Jones in that portrayal. Jerry was very matter of fact and serious. Took his work serious, but not too serious. But when I see that, it really makes me think there's Jerry, and so it sort of went from Jerry had an acting school that he ran. So Jerry came in to write the script. Jerry was involved heavily in the casting because he had that acting school where he brought a lot of people in. Jerry also, as I said, brought in Derville Martin. Jerry also knew Nick von Sternberg, who shot the movie, because they had worked together on a previous project. So he brings in Nick. So it ultimately, Jerry Jones may be the most integral figure in the creation of Dolemite than anybody. He really was the one who brought so many of those elements together to do that. Of course, Rudy had to be the one to finance it, and like in the film, he was able to get an advance on his royalties and money that he already had, and he thought he was going to be able to make that movie for $70,000. It did run out of money, not necessarily the exact same way that it shows in Dolemite Is My Name. I believe they had completed the filming, but sort of as they hint in the film, there was no money to edit it or do sound or any poster or anything like that. So they don't really show the struggle that Rudy had. Again, there's so many things you got to cover in the film. You're not going to have 40 minutes of Rudy struggling to do things. It would just be boring as hell. But in reality, it took Rudy 13 months traveling the country doing his material, performing gigs and such, and whatever money he was still making off of his records, which wasn't as much as he was earlier in the 70s because his sales had dropped off incrementally throughout the years. Of course, he floods his own market, but then everybody else goes, I'm not going to go to jail if I say the F word 1,000 times on a record. So everybody follows suit, and now not only has Rudy flooded his own market, but everybody else is doing that too. So he ended up having to basically, he says, I walked the country to finance that movie, and he'd make a couple grand, send it back home. They'd edit a little bit. They maybe shoot a couple scenes that they needed. And finally, after 13 months, I think the ultimate budget came out to twice that. It was 140 grand when he was finally able to complete it. And depending on Rudy's mood or what the conversation was, he would either, be a champion to that low budget, or he would be embarrassed by it. So it just depended on, how that broke down. If you look at 140 grand to make a movie, the stuff that AIP was doing is probably 300,000, 400,000, for their low end. Here you've got somebody who's doing something that's like a third of that. And it's a shabby movie. No one knew what they were doing really on the film. No one really had much, if any, professional experience, and it shows, but, people like to say, that it's a bad movie. I always go back to when people would say that, Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space is the worst movie ever made. Maybe they technically suck, but they're not, there's entertainment value there. Sometimes, and I've often commented that Dolemite is a movie you can laugh at and laugh with, because there's a lot of things that just are absurd or hokey or maybe just don't work. The martial arts is choppy. You can see scenes where the foot is 6 inches away from the face when they're kicking and but when I first saw Dolemite, it was obviously I guess we could say it was a life-changing experience, because I spent the next 30 years trying to find out who this man was and everything that he had done in his life. But it was like a bomb went off. It was something that is unexplainable. But I was just so intrigued. it was just cool, and it was weird, and it was just kind of like, what in the hell is this? You know? Yeah. And so prior to, and they show this in the film, Rudy does what they call four-walling. And again, this was another one of my kind of bonehead moments when I was with Scott and Larry going over the script. I'm sitting there saying, like, Rudy knows what four-walling is. Like, why are we telling this? And it's like, well, duh, Mark, the audience doesn't know what four-walling is, so we're going to have the theater owner explain this to Rudy so the crowd understands. And it's like, okay, and and that's what he did. He showed it in Indianapolis. They show that and he did play at Gordy's Lounge, just like they show in the film. And it went over well. And then he showed it again at the end of March. These were both in March of 1975. And then at the end of March, he showed it at another location. And then he took it back. He went back to Los Angeles. And he really only took it to 2 studios. He went to American International Pictures. They turned it down. Rudy always would tell the story that supposedly they had a black man that would watch the potential blaxploitation product, and he would say yes or no. He was kind of like their gatekeeper of what was good and what wasn't. And then that person turned it down. And according to Rudy, and who knows if this is just true or if it's just one of Rudy's great stories, that after Dolemite became a success, that they supposedly fired that guy at American International. I'm going to say it probably more so, one of those stories that Rudy liked to tell versus, I think I joke in the book that who knows, maybe the guy showed up late too many times to work or got fired on his own, and it wasn't just because Dolemite became successful. But Rudy always liked to tell great stories. But yeah, the second place that they took it to was Dimension Pictures, who released it nationally. And I will say that sometimes if I go back and we sort of compare, and there are comparisons that we can make with Dolemite Is My Name and Ed Wood, not just by the screenwriters, but also some critics had said this is kind of like Ed Wood Part 2. Because they have similarities in their careers where nobody supported them, but just through sheer force of will, they were able to complete, whatever it is that they were trying to do. And, while the ending of Ed Wood is this, triumphant premiere of Plan 9 from Outer Space, and everyone's giving him a standing ovation, and it's like this amazing thing. That's not something that ever happened. In that film, to me, that's sort of like Ed Wood's dream. He's imagining like my movie's going to premiere and everybody's going to cheer and it's going to be like the greatest thing ever. But for Dolemite Is My Name, when they show that premiere at the end of the movie, that's accurate. That was at the Woods Theater. There were people lined up around the block for hours. And as they say, like you hear the theater manager say something like, we're going to, show another showing at 2. And they kept that thing open for like 3 or 4 showings more than what was happening. And I remember Jerry Jones telling me about that night, because it's sort of similar to how they're driving it. Holy shit, like look at all the people out here. The theater owner had called Rudy in the hotel room and was like, there's all kinds of people out here, and they want, you guys should come down. And so he looks at Jerry and says, like they want us to go. And Jerry's like, let's go, man. Let's go down there. And when Jerry got out of the car, I specifically remember him telling me that there were so many people there and there was so much energy that he felt like he just floated out of the car, like floated out of the car into the theater. And, I mean, imagine, it's kind of emotional if you think about it. Everything that Rudy went through just to get that movie on a screen. And then to have an experience like that where, I mean, people were, according to Lady Reed, I think there was, they were circling the block 3 or 4 times, people waiting for that movie to play. And Rudy did just what is shown in Dolemite Is My Name. He hung outside. He entertained people. He told me that he walked through that line and shook everybody's hand, saying thank you for coming to see my movie.
I mean, that's a testament to the kind of person that he is too. I mean, because you think about a lot of stars today, go in their movies, they're not out, shaking everybody's hand and all that kind of stuff outside the theater. That's for sure.
So some of it, of course, it's genuine appreciation. I mean, imagine if you had pretty much everything in your life riding on something. If this movie failed, Rudy was done. Who knows if he would have ever recovered financially from this. He'd have lost his own investment, like they show in the movie. He would have been in debt to the record company for future royalties. So he bet everything on this, and and he always was a showman. This is a guy who spent his life performing in the Chitlin circuit. I believe there was a part in the movie that they had cut out. I'd love to see the footage someday if they ever make it available. But I think there's a scene where they go and they actually are walking through like a cow pasture. Rudy and Lady Reed, for Dolemite Is My Name. They're walking through a cow pasture to perform in a barn, and they had performed in a barn. Anywhere that they could have a performance was where they would go. And, that's really all Rudy ever knew was, pounding the pavement. That's how he made his records a success. It wasn't just that he found success, with Eat Out More Often in Los Angeles. He drove around the country and where you kind of see him in Dolemite Is My Name, where he's selling records out of his trunk. That was Rudy's reality. He drove all over the country, and he would oftentimes, without even a gig booked, he would show up in town, book himself a gig. He would find people, he would pass out records. He would say, he maybe, if we put a timeline on it, let's say he shows up in a town on a Monday. He goes, who knows? He goes to the truck stop. He goes into the African-American section of town, and he would find like pimps and hookers and people that he thought were like fun-loving looking people. He'd give them a record, say, go home and play this, share it with your friends. And by the way, Friday night, I'll be performing at such and such a club. And so he just built word of mouth constantly everywhere he went. And it's, you're not seeing Eat Out More Often being advertised to any great degree in magazines, or it's not getting played on the radio. I mean, there's almost nothing out there that's propelling this record forward other than Rudy. And for Eat Out More Often to place on, they had a soul charts at the time in Billboard magazine. It broke the top 50 in the soul charts. There was, I believe there was a comedy chart at the time, but because Rudy's stuff was so out there, he wasn't appearing in the same category as Bill Cosby. So they were putting him in the soul charts. And when he did his next album, which was called This Pussy Belongs to Me, that even got into the charts. So he was the first, what he calls soul comic, to have two albums at the same time charting on the soul album charts. So it's just, the more I learned about him, how can you not admire his tenacity and his drive? This guy was just, his career was his entire life. It meant everything to him. And it's unfortunate that he never was able to, bask in his own glory, so to speak. He never got rich. There's this one of those similar stories as so many artists have had where, people end up making all the money off of you. Rudy was so busy putting out material that he wasn't necessarily paying attention to the business side of things. I'm without a doubt, I know that he was probably owed quite a bit more than he received. In my eyes, he should have been living in a mansion, up in the Hollywood Hills. But you had a guy who was just kind of like living in an assisted living retirement place, close to the end of his life. And uh, the fact, it was very kind of hurtful to him. And when you get, you start to mortality sets in, you start to get to the, the twilight years of your life, and you're reflecting on things. And there, again, it's kind of like with the budget of Dolemite. Rudy was proud to always have been, pounding the pavement and making everything that happened in his life happen basically, through his own inertia. But there's a sadness to that too. Like, how hard have I worked, and this is all that I've gotten out of it? Or at this point, where is the money? Like, I still have to go out and work to survive, and you have a guy who's still basically doing the same thing, in the early 2000s as he was doing mid 70s, playing a small club. And, but that's what Rudy was. He wasn't an arena performer, and so, it's sad in some ways, but it's also, there's a brilliance to him and what he did. And I think it's amazing that for my own latitude, that I was able to document that, and it's able to be presented in this film. That's people like that. That's a dying breed. That stuff does not happen anymore. The same thing with Jimmy Lynch, and Jimmy Lynch is actually probably the biggest, what's the word I want to use here? I guess I could say having Jimmy Lynch in the movie is maybe the biggest exaggeration that they use in Dolemite Is My Name. And when I say that, is he absolutely deserved his character to be represented in that film. But the reality was that Jimmy was never there during the making of Dolemite. He actually shows up for like a cameo in the original Dolemite and gets a name drop because Jimmy was only in town for like one day for filming, and he shows up and did that because Jimmy himself was a singer and a comedian and an entertainer. He was on tour at that time when Dolemite was being filmed, so he just happened to be coming into town when they were shooting it, was able to make a cameo. But Jimmy was instrumental in Rudy's entire career. I mean, not only the fact that when they met, he had already done, a motherfucker on a record that inspired Rudy to take it further. But Jimmy was always there to help Rudy with his material, help him with all of his films. Jimmy was a set designer. He could carpenter. He could do everything. He made his own clothes. So when the following movies like Human Tornado and Petey Wheatstraw and Disco Godfather, and even when Rudy did his Dolemite Explosion film, Jimmy was a big part of all of that. And when you got those two together, and if you add Cliff Rockmore, who was the director of Human Tornado and Petey Wheatstraw, and also worked on Disco Godfather, like the three of them, when they're all together in their own ways, I think we're able to make magic. So it's great to have Jimmy represented in the film, although he wasn't there at the time frame that the film takes place. But you have things like, and this is another, we'll say poetic license that they used in Dolemite Is My Name, where they show the bed shaking scene where the ceiling falls down and everything. That actually was from the second movie, The Human Tornado. And in some ways, people criticized them for including this. And I agree with Scott and Larry of how could they not have included that? That is probably the most iconic and hilarious scene out of any one of Rudy's movies. How could you not include that? And there's no way they were going to be able to make a movie where they show every one of Rudy's movies being made. This would be a 6-hour film, and it would be the same story of, I don't have any money, and how are we going to make this happen? And, that's every time Rudy had a new project, it was like starting over from scratch, but to include that, it had to be there. And that is one of the funniest scenes in the film. And I particularly love the way that they present it when you kind of have, the D'Urville Martin characters kind of like, looking around, like when the bed's kind of, the room's kind of falling apart. It's just like, what the hell's going on in here? And they just did a brilliant job on that. But that was actually the whole bed shaking and all that stuff. That was all Jimmy's creation. He was the one who put the bed on casters and cut out the ceiling and put it on wires, and they got the flash powder. And so that whole setup from the human tornado was basically like Jimmy's creation, so he had to be in there. So I'm really glad that he was a part of that. And, I will say one of the highlights of my life was being able to sit there privately with Ben Taylor and Jimmy